Welcome back to the Top Notch Documentaries YouTube channel. Today I'm going to be covering the case of Matt Cox, a self-described narcissist, conman and fraudster. Matt spent 13 years in federal prison for mortgage fraud and is now out of prison. He conned banks out of somewhere between 11.5 and 15 million in multiple different frauds. Cox is most known for committing mortgage fraud. He is very confident and entertaining. His stories are interesting and funny. Despite what many would see as flaws, Matt is accepting of who he is and has taken accountability for his actions, not trying to justify his past criminal behaviour. Matthew Bevan Cox grew up in Temple Terrace, a suburb of Tampa, Florida. He came from a middle-class family and he had 3 adopted siblings. Matt struggled in public school because he had a learning disability, and this was dyslexia. At the time, Matt was put into the handicapped classroom because of this. Matt was smart and charismatic, but his schoolwork didn't reflect this. Later on, Matt managed to graduate from university with a degree in fine arts. Finding work proved to be a challenge with this degree, and so Matt earned an insurance license and was in that field for a couple of years. Work came and went, and it didn't really pan out for him, but his charismatic personality eventually landed him a new role as a mortgage broker. Matt had always had full intentions of being legit in his work, and fraud wasn't ever on his mind. That was until conducting his first ever loan. Matt's manager had modified a verification of rent document. The person didn't match all of the criteria, but by tweaking the document, the loan could now be closed. Matt was concerned, but his manager had played the severity of the situation down. Nobody is going to jail. Matt said that he was sweating bullets following this, but nothing happened. He felt ecstatic as he received a $3,500 broker's fee at 29 years old. Matt was in a bad place financially, being behind on his mortgage. The money had appeared at just the right time. He began closing lots of loans and was soon made the manager of another branch. He received a broker's fee for closing loans, so he didn't hold back. Matt made the comment that, if you walked through the door with a pulse, you're getting a loan. Everyone seemed to be winning, and it was too easy. Everyone was doing it in the late 90s and the early 2000s. To Matt, it was a victimless crime. Matt's fine arts degree had finally come in handy. Matt managed between 8 and 15 people, and most of the people working for him were committing fraud. Around 40 million in bad loans were conducted in total. One of the people working for Matt ended up starting another mortgage company. She was participating in a scam which ended badly. Wearing a wire to cooperate with the authorities, she gave up Matt Cox in an attempt to receive less incarceration time. Matt received probation in May 2001 and lost his mortgage company, which ended up in the hands of a friend. Much like the initial event which led to him committing fraud to begin with, this event was a major turning point for Matthew Cox. Adding to this was a situation that occurred a year prior to him losing his mortgage company. A woman had altered her name slightly and had been using her child's social security number, and she had a high credit score. She had a completely new credit profile because of this. It gave Matt the idea of making birth certificates for children under a year old. The documents were also created using his fine arts degree expertise. He made these fake documents and pretended to be a father whose son hadn't received his social security number. On getting the social security card, Matt made up synthetic identities and then worked toward attaining them good credit. His most notable synthetic identities being characters from the film Reservoir Dogs. And just a side note, Matt admitted that this had been a terrible idea. The judge didn't even see the humour in this decision at his trial. Matt put down money on rundown homes in Florida. He then borrowed even more from local banks. With some inside information from public records, he learned that by paying slightly extra, he could elevate the recorded price of the houses. Appraisers were confused as to how these shabby crack houses were worth so much. Subsequently, the neighbourhoods in which Matt purchased homes suddenly skyrocketed. Matt used his past experiences to forge documents and knew what questions would be put forth. He had found the perfect scheme. Continuing to make payments to the homes for a few extra months to capitalise further on the situation, eventually he let the houses go into foreclosure. Matt had also forged news documents about his synthetic identities having been injured in car crashes. They could no longer make the payments. The reason for the payments having been stopped could now be explained. In at least one example, Matt put down $40,000 and invested $10,000 into fixing up the property. He then borrowed $150,000. He pocketed the $100,000. Remember, he was doing this with many fictitious identities. This worked for roughly 2 years. Matt puts forth the number 11.5 million as being borrowed in that time span. He was still on federal probation at the time. An investigation into Matthew Cox had been started by the authorities in the early 2000s. This was because of cooperation by people who knew him and likely because of his previous charges of the similar white-collar type. Matthew Cox was given word by a close friend that the authorities were coming after him in a matter of days. This spurred a frantic decision that would impact Matthew Cox's life forever. He had to go on the run. He withdrew $80,000 from a local bank, and that was all he could withdraw. For Matthew Cox, his time spent on the run was enjoyable for the most part. Why bother turning yourself in when you know that the judge will throw the book at you? Having lived in Tampa for all his life, the decision was tough. Leaving everyone and everything behind couldn't have been easy, but the alternative was even worse. All Matthew Cox knew about prison was Shawshank Redemption. Matt wasn't alone. His girlfriend Rebecca Hawke wanted to join him. Rebecca, or Becky as she's known, is a single mother, and Matt seemed to have a habit of going after single mothers. She wanted excitement and Matt provided that outlet for her. They headed north to Atlanta and Matt continued committing fraud. With fake identities, Matt knew the strategy to survive. By now the FBI was looking for him and the Secret Service jumped onto the scene years later in 2005. The pair travelled across multiple states and the cash piled up. Cash was spent on surgery for both of them and Matt even considered getting leg surgery to become taller. He is 5'6". He didn't go along with this because Becky was insane and not taking her medication. They lived downtown in most of the cities that they stayed in. The money was vanishing fast and life wasn't very sustainable. He needed a real identity. His strategy evolved over time and soon real identification was being sent by the DMV to Matt with real names and Matt's photo. He also had all of these people's information. Matt had used a questionnaire format to pry the information from people and then he turned towards stealing the information of the homeless. The homeless were paid $20 and they gave Matt all of their details. Some of these questions included: where were you born? Where was your high school? What states have you had driver's licenses in? Do you have a felony? Do you have a job? The homeless don't tend to utilise their identity. They don't fly on planes. They don't own cars or houses. All of the information gathered from them was beneficial. No identities now secured, Matt and Becky went on vacation abroad and enjoyed the time spent together. The money was flowing again and everything seemed to be going great. But the relationship soon distanced as they argued frequently. Matt and Becky had separate residences and Becky relied on Matt to bring in the funds to fuel an affluent lifestyle. Matt had many loans on properties in the cities in which he lived, and although this isn't illegal, transactions had then been flagged as suspicious. As he withdrew money from local banks, he was handcuffed. Matt was apprehended under the name Gary Sullivan. Sullivan was a homeless male prostitute. The deputies that arrested him had a laugh upon finding this out. Matt dodged any charges because no crimes could be proven. He kept his composure, remaining calm under pressure. Having been released, he went and withdrew more money from banks. The most he took was $29,000 at one time. Matt had tried to secure a deal with the FBI. He wanted to turn himself in after a big fight with Becky, but he wasn't convinced that he could get a good deal. Later on, he would learn that the FBI were tracing his phone as he travelled. Years went by and it was now 2006. Matt was living in Nashville, Tennessee, and he was caught because someone close to his girlfriend figured out his real identity and became jealous. By this point, documentaries had been broadcasted about his case, American Greed being the most notable one. Matt's 13 co-defendants had already cooperated and received their punishment years before whilst Matt was on the run. Matt fully cooperated and received a 26-year plea deal, along with having to pay $6 million in restitution. He'd be getting out in 2030 at age 61. Matt cried from the courthouse to the US Marshals holdover. I don't blame him, I would have reacted in the same exact way. Matt served most of his time in Conman Federal Prison and has told some insane and hilarious prison stories. In prison he taught classes and even wrote his own memoir. He also wrote the life stories of some of his fellow inmates, one being Ephraim Deveroli, who was played by Jonah Hill in the film War Dogs. In prison he also met Frank Amadeo, a man who is convinced that he is destined to become Emperor of the World. Frank was a former attorney and helped Matt with his case, getting 7 years knocked off his sentence. When no street lawyer wanted to take on the case, thinking it to be impossible for Matt to get a time reduction, Frank took it on and made it happen. In total, Matt served 13 years of incarceration time. He got out in July 2019. The rest of the time reduction can be explained through this quote from Matt. He was constantly asked when his release date was. He would respond, "Well, it's 2030, but somebody could F up and tell me where they buried a body, and I could be out of here next week." His mother had always come for visitation at the prison. Being out of prison was great for Matt. He could finally visit his mum every week. Unfortunately, she passed away a few years later, but fortunately he got to spend some time with her, not behind the bars. Matt is now a true crime author and runs a YouTube channel. He's managed to put his incredible story out there for many to hear and learn from his mistakes. Unfortunately, he still has to pay his $6 million in restitution. This has been the Top Notch Documentaries episode on Matthew Cox. As always, thank you for watching.